Dear ladies and gentlemen, honored guest, we are happy to have you participate in Estonia Foreign Policy Institute organized webinar, Europe Strengthening Ties with the Indo-Pacific Region, the interest of Estonia and Japan. The political and economic importance of the Indo-Pacific region has rapidly grown, and with it also geopolitical tensions that are mostly embodied in the US-China rivalry. That also has impact on the international order. Estonian foreign policy has mostly been focused on its relationship with US, Europe, and Russia. This is due to our history, geographical location, and also limited resources. But in recent years, Asia's importance has also been rapid rise for Estonia. And we are looking to increase cooperation with like-minded partners to learn from their experience. Japan is one of exemplary countries in this regard, especially, for instance, how well it has stood up to Chinese economic coercion. So we have a lot to learn from our Japanese partners. For instance, for Europe, even the concept of Indo-Pacific is fairly new, but Japan has developed the notion and the concept of free and open Indo-Pacific already in 2007, if no longer, which focuses on the stability, rule of law, freedom of navigation, and economic development of Indo-Pacific region. So without much further ado, I will introduce our first speaker. This outline of the webinar is that we make the presentations of all the speakers, and after that we have half an hour for question and answers. We very much we very much welcome your discussions, the discussion questions. If please, could you leave them in the conversation chat together with your affiliation and also to whom do you want to address the question. So without much further ado, the first speaker will be Mr. Kotani. He is the professor of global studies at Meika University. He's also a senior fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs. His research is focused on Japan's foreign and security policy, the US-Japan alliance, and international and maritime security in the Indo-Pacific region. So please, Mr. Kotani, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Frank, for the introduction and also the invitation. So let me talk about Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific vision and its implication for the Japan-Europe cooperation. In fact, the concept of Indo-Pacific is an old one. The Western powers, the Portuguese, Dutch, French, and Britons actually developed that concept back in the 16th century. And the Great Britain became the queen of the Indo-Pacific by possessing the India, Singapore, and Hong Kong. And we have to remember that the China's Ming Dynasty also tried to develop the concept of Indo-Pacific even before the Western powers came to Asia. The Ming Dynasty tried to tried to increase its influence throughout the Indo-Pacific by dispatching the massive fleet. So the history shows the Indo-Pacific is a very important region, particularly for the global trade and economy. So Japan's FOIP was formally announced in 2016 by the former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe The question I got from the Europeans is whether or not Japan's FOIP is a containment of China. And I would say it is not the containment of China, but it's a balancing against the increase in China's power and influence in the region. We cannot contain China because China is our #1 trading partner. But still, we have to balance China's rising influence and power. So Japan came up with the concept of Indo-Pacific. But I would also say it is beyond the balancing the China, because there are lots of challenges and opportunities in this region. So we are trying to meet those challenges. So for example, there are still piracy incidents in this region. There are smuggling and human trafficking, massive disasters, and territorial maritime disputes. And these are undermining the freedom of navigation. And also they are destabilizing the regional order. So Japan's FOIP concept basically assumes that we should maintain rules-based international order, and also we have to maintain the freedom of navigation, and also we have to promote a peaceful dispute settlement, and also we have to maintain the rule of law. And this concept is first shared by the United States under President Trump when the Trump administration was seeking the strategic competition with China. And also the FOIP was shared by the Quad member countries and the ASEAN countries, and also the UK and the EU. And Japan is very much welcoming the Europeans' increased engagements in this region under the FOIP. Europe has been engaged in Asia through lots of mechanisms, including the ASEM. But more recently, the NATO countries have dispatched naval assets to this region. And together with Japan and the United States, those navies conducted the largest scale of exercise in this region last year. And there was a establishment of the AUKUS among UK, US, and Australia. And I think the primary reason why European countries are now increasing its engagement in this region is a possibility of a possible Taiwan contingency and the U.S.-China conflict, military conflict. So we are still not sure whether China is ready to invade Taiwan, but a likelihood is there, and this is a interaction issue. So if we fail to send a strategic signal to China, there might be, in fact, armed conflict. So together with US and European countries, Japan is trying to send a signal to China that the war is costly. So here, I think it's very important for Japan and European countries to work on this issue. And lastly, let me say a few words about what's going on in the Ukraine. Although Ukraine is not in the Pacific issue, but this is an issue of universal value of sovereignty and territorial integration. So Japan should not ignore the challenge posed by Russia against the Ukraine. And there's ongoing China-Russia strategic cooperation. So what's going on in the Ukraine may have a certain implication for this region in the Pacific, particularly for Taiwan. So I think Japan should join the sanction regime to punish Russia if Russia decides to invade Ukraine. And also Japan should show its force, perhaps through the certain kind of exercise in the Atlantic, Baltic Sea, Mediterranean, or Black Sea. As I said, Japan welcomes the European military engagement in the Indo-Pacific, but I think it should be reciprocal, and Japan should send its military force to Europe so that we can show our unity of our determination to protect the universal rules. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kotani, for excellent presentation. Looking forward already to the discussion later. So I just remind everybody to start asking questions in the chat with your affiliation. And also whom do you would like to address with your question. But without further ado, I will give the floor to Stephen Blockmans. He's a senior fellow at the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute. He's also the director of research at CEPS, Brussels. He's a professor of EU external relations law and governance at the University of Amsterdam and editor-in-chief of European Foreign Affairs Review. So please, Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Frank. It's a pleasure to talk at this webinar with Japanese colleagues and exchange views. What I will do in my short presentation is to make three arguments. First, the EU is a resident player in the Indo-Pacific with vital interests to defend and promote. Two, the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy has the potential of generating more cohesion in member states' individual outlooks towards the region, but the proof of the pudding will be in its eating. And three, whilst the new strategy gravitates towards economic topics, connectivity issues, the significance of cooperation with Japan extends particularly in the domain of maritime security, perhaps even defense. So let me start with the first, European interests. I mean, I will save you from all the figures, but just mention one, which is that the Indo-Pacific is home to more than 1.5 million European citizens, mostly French. And by extension, one can call the EU a resident player. And of course, as mentioned by Mr. Kotani, trade and the freedom of navigation have long been at the heart of European interests in this vast region, from the Red Sea to perhaps even the Bering Strait. And the Red Sea in particular is a vital artery through which 80% of the world's trade passes, at least via the Indian Ocean. It's one of the busiest maritime corridors, which channels an important proportion of global trade and nearly all exchanges between Europe and Asia each year. Now, more recently, European perceptions of the Indo-Pacific's growing importance have been largely driven by the rise of China, and especially Beijing's techno-ideological battle with Washington, and of course the tensions that this generates with respect to the security of supply chains, but also as a result of Chinese territorial drift. And we all know, the flashpoints that are at stake here, which are very much on the EU's radar as well. I would argue also that the European perceptions are driven by FOMO, the fear of missing out. The US, of course, has pivoted, brought even more power to bear in the region under Biden than under his predecessor, in part by refocusing attention from elsewhere, such as Afghanistan, and also by concluding, and this was mentioned, new coalitions aimed at bolstering capacities in the Indo-Pacific. And AUKUS in particular has unleashed the ire of France in particular due to the cancellation of this major contract to provide Australia with nuclear-propelled submarines and a lack of consultation between Washington and its European allies. But for all the talk about the many fissures that divide member states, I think their approaches towards the Indo-Pacific have actually been cohering over the last couple of years. Of course, it's well known that Europeans share a strong desire to preserve multilateral and rules-based approaches to both the regional and the global order, and they place a premium on partnership building with other resident Indo-Pacific powers in pursuit of these goals. But you see that naturally the differences that have existed, which arise mainly out of dealings with China, the opportunities, economic opportunities that they of course promise. Most member states, and not just those three that have been equipped for a bit longer with Indo-Pacific strategies, France, Germany, and the Netherlands, but especially smaller states on the eastern flank of Europe, whose primary concern is Russia's aggressive foreign policy posture, they are keen to avoid the anxieties about the US pivoting away from its role as a security guarantor in Europe. Perhaps those fears have been assuaged a little bit over the Ukraine crisis, but in the longer term, I think they remain. So I think these security considerations have blended with economic interests, and they've percolated upwards in the formulation of the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy, which, as I said, gravitates towards economic interests, which essentially, I mean, the conquest of market share is by definition a zero-sum game, which would mean that even those member states instinctively orientated to the region, in particular China, would serve their economic interests first, but they've de facto accepted the idea that the Indo-Pacific is also, if not primarily, about managing or even about managing the rise of China. Still, the speed with which this EU Pacific strategy was developed, barely 5 months between April and September 2021, suggests that not all of the member states' individual concerns and interests have been taken into account. And that in turn may explain why the joint communication put forward by the European Commission and the High Representative was not mentioned after the informal European Council in October, or indeed formally endorsed by the Foreign Affairs Council of that same month. But as was mentioned, the bombshell announcement of AUKUS on the eve of the presentation of the EU's joint communication has eclipsed the Union's strategy. Worse, perhaps you could say that it has underlined the rest of the world's perception about the EU's relative irrelevance as a geopolitical actor in this vast region. And here, what the strategy doesn't do is provide much clarity on how the EU in fact intends to balance China by engaging with partners. And as many EU policies depend on voluntary participation, member states are comfortable accepting objectives which they support in principle, but do not feel bound to contribute towards in practice. And this can either be because they do not have the capacities, or simply because they wish to avoid adopting any attitudes China may perceive as confrontational. So this dichotomy is particularly striking when it comes to security issues. And I think in this particular field, a rather expansive interpretation of cooperation with resident powers like Japan is key, not a narrow one that is dependent on the definition of Europe's red lines in the region, and a cooperation in the area of defense. But as was suggested before, maritime security, malicious cyber activities, disinformation, countering terrorism, of course, violent extremism, hybrid threats, organized crime, trafficking, you name it. And here, there's quite a bit of cooperation already between the EU and Japan, and it helps, of course, that Japan's FOIP and the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy resonate to a great extent, as was mentioned by Mr. Kotani, with especially, an emphasis on freedom of navigation, rule of law, free trade. The bilateral relationship is further underpinned by the EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, which echoes this type of view, as well as the Strategic Partnership Agreement, where both partners have recognized the need to avail themselves of limited military means for crisis management, arms control, maritime security, and issues of human security. And the EU-Japan have cooperated in many operations, concrete operations as well, in the Gulf of Aden in particular, but also in the wider Indian Ocean. And there's much potential still to dock, if you want, Japan closer to the EU's own security operations in the area. There is, as of yet, no formal framework participation agreement, but it has been suggested, at least in talks in Brussels, off record, that ad hoc Japanese contributions to individual CSDP missions might be provided for through a more legal and institutional framework. And that could be indeed a ramp towards building up on, more proactively involving Japan, also in other initiatives such as CRIMARIO, the Critical Maritime Routes Situational Awareness Initiative, and extend Japan's cooperation in individual member states' coordinated maritime presences in the Indo-Pacific, where either France or other member states take the lead, basically, for European coalitions to do port calls in the Indo-Pacific and coordinate freedom of navigation exercises. This, together with potentially an extension of an invitation to Japan to either observe or participate in the EU's budding defense capability structures, PESCO, might provide, just like is already happening with third states and the US and the UK in particular, of course, might provide further grounds to develop, a technological and industrial base which is more complementary to action in the field. The addition of an EU military advisor in Tokyo EU delegation might help in this coordination as well. So there are, in some, quite a few concrete lines, I think, for EU-Japan maritime security and defense cooperation, which could be further explored on the basis of the strategy papers, which chime a lot in their objectives. But implementation for both will be key in order to ramp up that credibility. That's it for me for now, Frank.
Even for explaining the diverse and multifaceted approach of Europe to Indo-Pacific, and also explaining the first glimpses of increased cohesion. And of course, like often said, with many policy issues, the big problem is implementation. But with the help of our partners in the region, we hope to reach these shores as well. With great success. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Mr. Suzuki. He is a professor of Graduate School of Public Policy at University of Tokyo. Suzuki is also a senior fellow at Asia-Pacific Initiative, an independent policy think tank. His research focuses on Indo-Pacific political economy, and with keen interest and expertise also in Japanese space policy. So without further ado, please, Mr. Suzuki, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Frank, and thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting workshop. My name is Kazuto Suzuki. I've been working on the sort of a juncture between the economy and security. So both Mr. Kotani and Mr. Blockman has mentioned that there are sort of a separate dilemma of the relationship between Japan and China, or China and the EU, that there are deep interdependence between in the economy, but there is a tension in the security and the political side. My research is focusing on how these two domains are in conjunction of the problem, and this is where the concept of economic security arrives. And the concept of economic security is now being the buzzword in Japan because the new Kishida administration has set up the ministerial position for the economic security. They are now preparing for the set of the measures in the legal measures to promote the economic security. And the economic security in the global sense is not really a very familiar word. So I'll just try to explain what this means and how this related to the Indo-Pacific issue, especially with regard to the deep interdependence and integration of the economy in Indo-Pacific region and the political tension. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about the possible area of collaboration between Japan and EU. So let me just define what economic security is. The economic security, by definition of the Liberal Democratic Party, where the Prime Minister is coming from, is to protect the national interest by the economic means. But this is very general. So there are two major focus on this, the measures of the economic security. One is the strategic autonomy, which resonates what President Macron of France is doing, is saying, but it's less military strategic security. It's more economic security, economically strategic autonomy, which means that we do not depend heavily on China or the supply chain and the technology. You know, these are interchangeable. It's so integrated and interdependent. So because of the interdependence, we'll create a vulnerability. And in order to reduce the vulnerability, we need to build up our own capabilities for the technology, the critical technologies for the industry, emerging technologies, and the critical supply, such as the medicine or the, you name, the semiconductor or the batteries for the electric cars, you name it. So the strategic autonomy is the one pillar of the economic security. The other pillar is the economic strategic indispensability, which means that Japan needs to develop its unique technology, unique industry, unique product, which makes Japan indispensable in the globalized market. And if we have so much indispensability, then it will hesitate. It will make other countries hesitate to attack and coerce Japan for the economic purposes or even using the military means. So the strategic indispensability is somewhat similar to the concept of deterrence. And this is why the economic security is called security. And currently, there are discussions, the government is preparing the bill, the new law for promoting the economic security. One is to supply chain resilience. There are four pillars of the new proposed draft bill. One is the resilience of supply chain. The second one is to maintain and protect the critical infrastructure, and the third one is to to classify patents, because the patents usually it's open and public, but if this is a very sensitive technology, then Japan, this law will be able to make this patent classified. And the fourth is to build up the science and technology basis, which is to promote the indispensability. So these are the four pillars, and the new law will provide will associate it with the certain funds, public funds for promoting the science and technology for the indispensability, but at the same time to encourage businesses to bring their production site back in Japan, onshoring, or to move to the third countries such as Taiwan, Thailand, elsewhere. And also there are the maintenance of the critical infrastructure. We will look and double check whether there are the critical infrastructure is using the Chinese products. So that if in case of emergency, the China will not remotely attacking the critical infrastructure by activating some sort of a hidden code in the 5G switching board or something like that. So that's the idea of the economic security, and this is what the Japanese government, the current Kishida government, is trying to do. And the key concept of the economic security is the vulnerability, the dependence and the vulnerability. If you depend on one country, particularly China, then it will make the China will use the coercive means to put pressure on Japan by economic sanctions. And this has happened in 2010 when Japanese Coast Guard has captured the Chinese vessel and arrested the captain of the vessel because of the violation of the Japanese law. And the China has put pressure on Japan by prohibiting the export of the rare earth mineral to Japan. So, and currently China is exercising such economic might to coerce other countries, to Taiwan, to Australia, to Norway. There are many cases that you can witness, and there are plenty of evidences that China is using such economic might for the political purposes and strategic purposes. So we need to avoid the dependence, and we need to reduce the vulnerability. In order to do so, we need to build up the stockpiles, we need to diversify the supplies, and we need to invest and innovate to something that we are something that we don't use the products and the materials coming from China. So, and also it's extremely important to have a trade with the trust. And the Japanese government is now trying to build up the economic alliance with United States and the other friends and the friends and allies, like-minded countries, to reduce such risks and to secure the supply chain. So in that context, the Japan and EU relationship becomes very important, because Japan and EU has the Economic Partnership Agreement, EPA, and the Strategic Partnership, SPA. And this combination is perfect to suit for the economic security argument, because on the one hand, it's a strategic partnership. The strategic partnership involves many domains, including science and technology, space, cyber, etc., etc. And we do have the economic partnership. So we can build up the economic alliance altogether to avoid the dependence on China. And of course, the EU also have the lot of stakes, economic stakes in China, but also facing the similar dilemma because of the not much about the military issue, but the human questions of human rights and democracy. So I think it is the time that Japan and EU to team up to put pressure on China on using its, Japan and the EU's economic power to force China to reconsider its exercise on the human rights in Xinjiang province or Hong Kong, and we can also work together to reduce the dependence on the high-tech products to China. And I think this is the time that the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific is already changed by Chinese technological development, and there are, China became as a superior partner, superior party in the certain technological domain, for example, the 5G or hypersonic gliders. But I think this technological superiority of China needs to be challenged by the alliance of the Japan, EU, and possibly US to have and encourage the innovation and development of the new technology, which surpasses the Chinese innovation. And I think this is the time that the race for the high-tech competition is now on, and I think Japan and EU are doing Japan and EU is a perfect partner to encourage each other and to compete with China. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Suzuki, for your excellent presentation. It's quite often mentioned this kind of protective measures against economic coercion, but not that widespread is the countermeasure that I really like that you highlighted, strategic indivisibility. So, but one country I think that really shines through in this field is Taiwan. As Taiwan is the powerhouse of semiconductors, which makes it extremely important for international supply chains, be it car manufacturers, green energy, and so on. I will be the next speaker, so I will introduce myself. I'm a research fellow at the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute. And my presentation actually will focus on Taiwan and Taiwan's security and how it directly impacts or changes in the status quo directly impact the Indo-Pacific region and indirectly also impact Europe. In September 2019, at the Central Party School, Xi Jinping made a historical remark that during Mao Zedong, China stood up. During Deng Xiaoping and his descendants, it became rich, and reference to himself, China will become powerful. One obstacle standing on its pathway is Taiwan. Taiwan is important to China for its strategic location. Without Taiwan, China cannot access uninterruptedly the Pacific Ocean. and as such escaped the entanglement of US and its allies from the first island chain. Xi Jinping has on several occasions mentioned that resolving the Taiwan issue cannot be postponed forever to the future generations. And China and the joining Taiwan with China is seen as part of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese people. So this already sets the timeline for Taiwan's accession by 2049. And in already 2005, China passed the anti-secession law, which creates the legal ground of using force, using non-peaceful means if Taiwan is to secede from China. Even more violent in recent years, Xi Jinping at the 100th anniversary of Chinese Communist Party said that China is to smash Taiwan's independence plots to achieve national rejuvenation. So ever since Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen took office in 2016, China's pressure on Taiwan has increased. Just during a couple of days in last fall, Chinese airspace was violated by over 150 PLA planes. Just last Sunday, during Japanese US-Japan joint naval exercises in close proximity to the Philippines, Taiwanese airspace was violated by 39 warplanes. In at least half a year, China has established its presence in close proximity to Japanese Nansei Islands that are just 300 kilometers from the Taiwan's coast. This Chinese warships' presence there will hinder US and Japan's response in case of a conflict in Taiwan Strait. But of course, these developments have not gone unnoticed by Japanese authorities, which have become more explicit in expressing their concern in regard of developments in Taiwan, in regard of the Taiwan Strait issues. Former Deputy Defense Minister Nakayama, while still in the office, said that Japan must defend Taiwan both for ideological and also security reasons. Taiwan, first of all, is a democracy, and attack on Taiwan would seriously impact the security of Okinawa and US troops there. There is also widespread support for more strong relationship or more strong support to Taiwan in Japan. For instance, just recent public opinion poll conducted in April 2021 found out that 74% of respondents are supportive of more close and active participation of Japan in the stability of Taiwan Strait. And the current Prime Minister Kishida has been also acting out based on this support. Even before he took the office, he supported Taiwan's accession to the CPTPP trade bloc. Just recently, he expressed support for Taiwan joining the WHO. But the main question that remains is that will Japan support Taiwan in case of a military conflict? And former Deputy Prime Minister Aso said in 2021, with reference to the constitution, that Japan would have to defend Taiwan, as an attack on Taiwan would relate to the survival threatening situation for Japan. As I understand now, many Japanese experts have explained this stance is that China's attack on Taiwan would most likely also require China to conduct precision missile strikes on US troops stationed in Japan and near it. Japan's security is closely knitted with the USA through security alliance and commitments it entails. This is why an attack on US or its troop would hinder the survival of Japan, and such would also justify Japan's assistance to both US and Taiwan in cross-strait conflict. In the end of the last year, it was reported that Japan's self-defense forces, together with US counterparts, drafted joint operation plan for Taiwan's contingency, which envisions the establishment of US Marine temporary attack base there, supported or equipped with high mobility artillery rocket systems on Nansei Island. That would be of vital importance during the initial stage of Taiwan conflict. Of course, Japan was rather reserved, as it has to be according to its constitution, that it would provide logistical support in regard of fuel and ammunition. Another topic that comes into mind in regard of these developments in connection to the Europe is, would Russia come to China's assistance if there was a conflict in the Taiwan Strait? And the question without doubt is no. Actually, neither of them, not Russia or China, is interested in fighting each other battles. Nor do they have alliance that entitles support to each other in terms if one of them is in a conflict. But a question I would like to ask is that has Russia been supportive or has it anyway assisted China in its plans of joining Taiwan, achieving the national revolution, if needed by means of force? And the answer to this question is yes. The technology transfer that has taken place between China and Russia, Russia has sold its advanced technology, be it the S-300, S-400 batteries, Su-35 fighter jets, without have increased the capability of China to great area access denial capabilities that are needed to block China, US and its allies' assistance to Taiwan in case of a conflict. Also, joint exercises have increased or have enabled China to learn from its more experienced partner how to conduct war. Also, joint naval exercises have increased operability, deployment speed, and so on. Also, China has learned from Russia how to modernize its army, how to prepare to handle regional conflicts instead of managing large-scale attacks. Also, China has learned from Russia how to conduct hybrid warfare. Already in 2003, it approved the concept of three warfares, how to increase plausible deniability in case of Taiwan's contingency. It would be very likely that, similarly to Ukraine, Chinese green men transported by civilian vessels could be part of Chinese invasion of Taiwan. But both these actions, be it the situation, worsening security environment in Europe, or worsening security environment in Indo-Pacific, are in a way related to lack of response. There was very limited response to Russia's intrusions to Georgia, Ukraine, Syria. Limited response to Chinese island building and militarization of artificial islands in the South China Sea, in its activities in Hong Kong or Xinjiang. The thing is, with the authoritarian powers, their hunger just grows with each violation of international law. But this, without doubt, these developments are without doubt related to each other. The appeal to Russia in China's incursion to Taiwan would be increased operational space in its sphere of interest in Europe. And without doubt, this would also impact if, or like we are seeing already, there are increased tensions in Europe in regard of Ukraine. This without doubt also increases the operational space for China to conduct its operations or potential military threats towards Taiwan. To sum up, the US focus moving on Asia Pacific would mean that the Japanese problem today could become an Estonian problem tomorrow, because in the environment of limited capabilities, there are not enough resources for both the European and Asia Pacific regions. On the other hand, the same applies to China. Stronger relations between Europe and Asia and East Asian partners increases the cost of conflict for China, as China is not interested in facing sanctions on both of its main target markets, Europe, US, and Asia. Therefore, Lithuania's actions in deepening cooperation with Taiwan should be applauded and followed. Lithuania is not doing something totally new, but merely following a widespread trend that many European countries are following, like Stephen so well highlighted. Even the EU-Pacific strategy stresses the importance of increased cooperation with Taiwan. The deeper and more widespread are the engagements of Taiwan with its European partners, the higher the cost of China to change the status quo in cross-strait relations. By strengthening ties with the Indo-Pacific region, the EU member states could directly contribute to the peace and prosperity of Indo-Pacific region, and indirectly also improve the security environment of Europe. Thank you. Thank you so much. Without further ado, I will give the floor to Maret Nukke. She is an associate professor of School of Humanities at Tallinn University. Nukke has graduated from Institute of Humanities in 1998, has closely followed the bilateral relationship between Estonian and Japan develop over the decades, not only from the perspective of a scholar, but also from the perspective of enabler of cooperation between Japan and Estonia, acting as a consultant and translator. So without further ado, Maret, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you for the introduction, because yes, as my CV that was, or short introduction that was shared with everyone would have had an impact that I am involving only in the research of Japanese classical no theater, and that I should say that this is my research is more like an hobby, I would say, shumi in Japanese. Yes, But during maybe last 20 years or more, I have been teaching at the university Japanese society and politics, so and foreign politics included. So I am very familiar with these issues also. And as you, Frank, said, I have been acted as an interpreter since 1994, but I currently have quit this job as a interpreter in Japanese and Estonian business contexts. Seen many of them since the beginning of 1990s and followed what has happened in this century. And I have also an experience working in a Japanese company. It was a long time ago, one year at Toyota Estonia. I had a Japanese boss and everything. So that was my introduction into this field. But today, as I understand, this webinar has been focused more to the issues that involves EU and the relationship of EU and Japan, but my task will be then to share some light what has happening in the relationship of Japan and Estonia specifically. So all that has been already discussed today, we can see this kind of perspectives also in this bilateral relationship also, but I have to say that it has been a very slow process into my eyes. It could have been this development of the bilateral relationship of these two countries could have been more rapid for years ago already, but fortunately in this century we have seen some developments that I would give you a short review of this, what has been done and how has it been done, and maybe some I will provide some critics also what should be these prospects in the future that also involves, as I said, all these issues that have been discussed already today. Last year, as you probably very well know, we celebrated 100 years of diplomatic relationships between Japan and Estonia. Firstly, these diplomatic relations were established in 1921 and re-established in 1991 when Estonia gained its second independence. And from that started from the 1990s, we have seen that the relationship in the highest level, I mean from Estonian side, Estonian presidents and ministers, and from the Japanese side, the Prime Minister Abe in 2018, and more than a decade before that, the Emperor of Japan came to Estonia. So this kind of visits from very high political level has been happening in this century, and this development has been, as I view it, in increasingly frequent, and this is a very good development, of course. But as I see from various documents that have been developed during all this maybe last 10 years, I would say, because before that we had no strategies toward Asia and including toward Japan at all. So this development has also been increasing, but it seems that those who had created these many strategies starting from 2011, and the last one was created Estonian Business Diplomacy Agenda for Japan between 2020 and 2025. It was created in 2020. It seems that all these strategies only seems to have the basis of the future, making possible the future contacts or these political representatives and of companies that already exist, or the know-how or technology or developments that already have been taking place in Estonia, particularly. So this big view of how could we develop these bilateral relationship, I would say it is rather shallow, or it cannot be. It is not visible, so visible in these strategies. These first strategies that were made by several Estonian ministries in 2011, 2012, several free strategies altogether, 2013 and 2014 before there is the last strategic view of development of this relationship. These all were like more like documents of ideas. Where should this relationship develop? But all these lack the very concrete actions or the views how to make possible these contacts or these future developments, and this is not a very good aspect of all these strategies. So when I listened also today, all the previous speakers, I understood that we have in Estonia and also in Japan, we have many possibilities to grow even more to this real cooperation, and this cooperation should be based on very wide aspect. It is not, of course, right now we have the crisis in Ukraine, which is very, Ukraine is very near to Estonia also. It is Europe, so we feel this anxious atmosphere every day. I have had an impression that many Estonian people are very anxious and afraid that it will be war soon, but I don't believe that. So it is very, very anxious, and of course, if we see, if you look to Asia, then as Frank spoke about Taiwan, that Taiwan is very important partner for Japan, and in the past decades, we, for example, in Tallinn University, we had the first contacts with Taiwan universities, not in the university within universities in China. So we also feel that as Frank also said, the democracy in Asia that Japan represents for us, and also Taiwan, it's very, very important. So we could see that the security aspect is of course very important, but in Estonia we have to look for other possibilities to find some aspects or themes where we could cooperate with Japan in every level. It means that it is not only the security that has been talked much about, but the security also bases on the economic security that Professor Suzuki already talked about. That it is the strategy of economy should be in Estonia also that that if we had very profound cooperation in every field with Japan as representative of democracy and economic power and political power also in Asia, then it would be very prospective and very wishful for Estonia also in, for example, in the security problems with Russia and Ukraine that is going on now. If Japan would take more if we had more cooperation in every field in NATO also, and green energy, technology development, academic field also, in cultural ties, then it would be beneficial for both sides, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you, Maret, for an interesting presentation. Without further ado, I will introduce our last speaker, Mr. Takamizawa, who we have cooperated before as well. His video in LMC Talks has been one of our hits that focused on disarmament, non-proliferation. And Mr. Takamizawa is a visiting professor at University of Tokyo. Takamizawa has served as an ambassador of Japan to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva from December 2016 to January 2020, and has a prolific career working as an official for the Japanese Ministry of Defense. So without further ado, Mr. Takamizawa, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. And I think I try to be very brief. Let me begin with our national security strategy making. Prime Minister Kishida articulated his intention to review the national security strategy, as well as national defense program guidelines and the 5-year defense plan in 2022, this year. So this is a very important year. And I understand that NATO is, I think, agreeing on the new strategy. Sorry. So within the national security strategy, the relationship between China and Japan is kind of a mutually beneficial strategic relationship. And so it's really important how to review this concept. And I think that there are so many activities that China is not doing what they have promised in the international community, and also the Japan-US relations and Japan-China relations. So I think that we have to be very careful in changing and redefining the strategic relations. But I think it's really important that to maintain the dialogues and kind of cooperation between China and Japan. So the strategic benefits we both have. So a definition would be needed, and a new definition would be needed. But it doesn't mean that we don't have a common strategic interest. So I think that's a very important element. And secondly, with regard to the Japan-US relations, I think that the US government, Biden administration, made a very good start at the outset. But somehow we haven't seen very tangible and concrete measures that allies and partners can collectively work. And so, and also as many other panelists talked about, that the withdrawal from Afghanistan is a really challenge, and a lot of aftermath, I think, were made. So it is really challenging for the US and NATO partners that to make a really good coordination and making a holistic approach to Ukraine, and not in just military, but in other fields. So people in Asia are looking at what will be happening between Russia and NATO. So I think that that's really will have a great impact in Asia. So it is related to the trust of the U.S. Credible deterrence or U.S. credibility or U.S. commitment. So I think that the U.S. is now fighting two fronts. Nuclear armed China, which is becoming a triad status, and also Russia still have a lot of power in nuclear arsenal. So I think that the challenge is really great. So it's really high time for Europe and Japan and ASEAN countries and others, Korea, Australia, to come up with a kind of a specific plan to support U.S. because the U.S. is kind of driven by the domestic politics, and I think the challenge to democracy is not just in China and Russia, but in the US, probably in Japan and in Europe as well. So we shouldn't too much focus on the strength of democracy. We need to be very frank in assessing the situation right now. And the change has happened. And certainly COVID-19 gave us has given a lot of impact. So we have to be very frank in kind of the behaving and sincerely working as an international partner. So that's I'd like to point out. And second point is that China, I think, has been conducting very, very difficult and different approaches to the international community in the world. So we should know that the most important core interest of China is the survival of a Chinese Communist Party, and which Xi Jinping has been articulating recently. And also core interests are related to the survival of the Chinese Communist Party. So we have to define core interest in that way. So we shouldn't too much, I think, listen to what Chinese people are saying, but rather we have to look at what is happening, and in Taiwan, in Senkaku Islands, and so in South China Sea. And I believe that what is most important is that South China Sea and East China Sea, Taiwan, and Senkaku Islands are one issue, all related to the Chinese nuclear strategy and also the maritime security and safety. So I think that we shouldn't, I think, deal with these issues in a very different way. It's one issue. So as many panelists talked about, South China Sea has been changed dramatically. In 1992, China issued a territorial waters law, and in 20 years or more that we have seen very different approaches. So China is really good at making laws and constantly, and it's really a very, very good initiative. They define their ambiguity on their own terms and put it into practice, and then they change the status quo and gradually, and as a result, many changes are happening. So that's what we have seen in Chinese approach. So we have to be realistic about assessing these trends and so forth. And so Europe and Japan and ASEAN and other countries need to be united, I think, to at least share understanding what is happening in Asia Pacific and in the Pacific region. And with regard to Russia, Russia is really an interesting country to Japan. And probably you may not know that National Security Strategy, 2013 National Security Strategy, doesn't refer to Russia in a negative sense. No, a very positive sense, only positive sense. But Ukraine and Crimea and so forth. So we have seen so many difficult, I think, things with regard to Russia. So I think that reassessment of Russia is really important in the national security strategy making. But what is really different between Russia and China is great. And from a Japanese perspective, China is a superpower and kind of rising power, and Russia isn't. And also economic power have a very, very great difference. And Japanese trade is dependent on China, 25%, 30%, or 20%. But it's really a very, very huge, I think, influence. So when we think of the global supply chain issue, it's really hard to be decoupling all. So middle level, I think interdependence will be really needed. And so we have to distinguish the real dependence or vital dependence and the kind of mutually beneficial interdependence. So I think the issue is not really simple. So that's a kind of note I like to talk about. And with regard to Taiwan, I think Taiwan is really an important point. And Japan should be, I think, thinking of Taiwan in all its aspects. And I am saying this, Japan needs to be making a more holistic approach to Taiwan, and not focusing on military, and not focusing on just economy, but much more integrated and comprehensive way. So what is really important is that to maintain high-level, multi-layered contacts between the region and Taiwan, and Europe and Taiwan and so forth. That can include parliamentarian exchanges or port visit or kind of economic cooperation or humanitarian relief and disaster relief cooperation and capacity building in the region and so forth. I think Taiwan is really a key player. So I think increased interest by Europe in Taiwan could help Japan, I think, to have much broader and comprehensive relationship between Japan and Taiwan. I think the increased number of students are learning in Taiwan now from Japan and so forth. So I think that's the area that the EU and Japan can cooperate. That's my point. And finally, with regard to FOIP, that we need to work on the specifics, not kind of just talking about what is the desirable status and so forth. And so we have to identify the projects underway, not just by the government, but rather by the private entities and industries and so forth. And then if we can find some good project, why not, I think, naming which country will be leading and cooperating and so forth. So Japan, one of the ASEAN countries and one of the EU countries, for example, 3 countries can be taking the lead in some project or in some country and so forth. And with regard to the Japan-Estonia, I think relations, I think that the current national security strategy is describing what kind of cooperation Japan is doing, US, UK, and so forth. So I think one good way is that if we can come up with a very ambitious, not ambitious, but robust, I think, agenda between, for example, Estonia and Japan, or other European countries and Japan or something, or maybe 3 countries, including Estonia. So such a kind of relationship. We can define the future action items in the national security strategy making. Then we can break down that kind of item into very specific areas, even minor, but need to be very specific that we can work on. So this is a kind of just an idea I can offer. But so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Takamizawa, for your excellent recommendations and points made. We have received one question, and this is referred to or addressed to Mr. Kotani. I will read out the question, and Mr. Kotani, could you please answer? There are some similarities drawn between Russia and China, Ukraine to Taiwan. Might China be tempted to follow Russian example of 2008 and 2014 against Taiwan, considering the upcoming Beijing Olympics?
Well, thanks for the question. I think I said in my presentation, it's up to the interaction between China and the international community, whether or not Xi Jinping will decide to invade Taiwan. So if the international community fails to respond to the current situation in Ukraine, then that might send a wrong message to Xi Jinping, and Xi Jinping might think even if he decides to invade Taiwan, U.S. and other international community would not intervene. So we have to continue to send a right signal to the Xi Jinping that if he decides to invade, that would invite a harsh response from the international community. Otherwise, Xi Jinping might miscalculate the situation.
Thank you. Any other comments from the speakers? If no, then I have one question of my own to Mr. Suzuki. I really like the 4 pillars that you highlighted in increasing resilience against economic coercion. But I was wondering, are there any policies implemented or discussed in regard of academic cooperation with China, for instance? As China is known for using the openness of academic cooperation in its favor. Quite often, also PLA officers are pretending to be students while they are actually intelligence officers. So, please, Mr. Suzuki.
Yes, we are pretty much aware of the risks of accepting the Chinese students for the universities and academic exchange. We have in 2019 there was a reform of the a law with regard to the export control, and the transfer of technology to the Chinese student is deemed as an export. So the export control law, which is the foreign exchange, foreign trade law, has allowed the university to not to grant the admission to the certain student with a background of serving for the military and graduating the military-oriented universities, such as the Chinese Military Academy. And but of course, this is not perfect, and there'll be always the forged status of the actual certain industrial spy, or those who have served in the PLA. But at least we do try, and we are aware of the risks of the accepting Chinese student for with certain purposes. So the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, and the Ministry of Education, Science and Industry, Science and Technology are issuing the certain regulations or certain announcements to make universities and research institutes aware of certain cases. And the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry has set up the certain list, well, let's say the blacklist of the universities which are involved in the military research. So the universities refer to that list, and in certain cases, they can reject the admission or application of the Chinese students. So that sort of thing is happening. And also, we are now paying. We have recently changed the regulation on the same law for the transfer of the researchers coming from China or even not coming from China or any other country. Even the Japanese, who has the direct interest with China, will be regarded as the agent for the Chinese or the foreign entity. So that the transfer of technology to that person, no matter whether it's foreigners or Japanese, the transfer of technology requires the license. So if there is a transfer of technology, then the person who is transferring requires to apply for the license at the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. So we do have certain measures to at least to minimize the risk of transfer of technology.
Thank you. That's excellent examples. As I know, Estonia has not yet approved or passed legislation in regard of screening of foreign direct investment. So there is something for us to learn from experience and of Japan. There was one last question. I'm afraid we cannot take any more because we are running out of time already. But this isn't addressed, so anybody from the speakers can address this one. How will the CPTPP playbook roll out regarding China and Taiwan, Chinese and Taiwanese membership? Anybody? Mr. Takamizawa?
That's really a good question. And what I believe important is that to kind of strictly abide by the essence of the CPTPP. So that we need to be realistic, and we need to deal with requests or problems very, very seriously and sincerely, and it may take a lot of time. So it's really a matter of the agreement and consensus. So that's what I think I can say now. So, but that's really good question, and I think Professor Suzuki has a lot to say, if I may ask him. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, just quickly, one of the problem is the absence of United States, because the CPTPP was supposed to be a TPP with United States, but it's no longer the case, and we are not expecting the Biden administration will apply for the TPP. So what is going to happen if we accept China as a member of the TPP? That has been the major subject of debate. But as Professor Takamizawa said, I think the most important thing is that even if we try to negotiate with China, it is extremely important that the high quality free trade of CPTPP needs to be protected. In other words, we shall not let the security exemptions and Chinese some sort of those national exemptions shall not be accepted. So that is going to be the key. And there is a fear that the China will put their economic coercions and political pressure on the other member states of the CPTPP, such as Singapore, New Zealand, etc. And there will be a possibility that those countries will support Chinese exemptions, which do it in favor for China. But I think Japan, together with Canada, Australia, to hang tight to strictly stick with the playbook and to maintain the high quality of the free trade. Otherwise, the value of CPTPP is not going to be very. I think that we can undermine the value of the CPTPP. So and the question of Taiwan. Taiwan has much more possibility of being, Taiwan deserves to be a member of CPTPP, but this is a very much political issue. So I think there will be no Taiwan single out being a member of the CPTPP. I think the only option, if we accept Taiwan, is to accept China altogether at the same time. So that's it from me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all for your contribution. Thank you for the excellent questions. I learned a lot. Hopefully we could organize some future webinars in similar nature, sharing experiences and also about our threat perception interest. So thank you all, and look forward to cooperating with you in the future. Bye-bye.